Okay, so in this video, I'm going to compare subways, taxis, Ubers, and Lyfts. Wow, that was a mouthful. Transportation could be really intimidating here, especially if you're coming here for like the first couple times or you're still new to the city. It can feel like you have no idea how to get around the city at all. Let me start with the subways. The subways can be really intimidating at first because you're like, I do not understand which trains go downtown, uptown, across town, forget it. It's very confusing. And I have a separate video. I'm not sure if it's posted either before this one or after this one on breaking down the subways for you, because I know that's very overwhelming. Honestly, sometimes even when I'm going to like a specific place in like Brooklyn or something, sometimes you're just like, in my mind, I'm like trying to remember which exact subway would even go to that area. Like, it's still confusing for people who live here. It doesn't take too long to get the basic Manhattan ones down if you're just in Manhattan, but when you are going to other boroughs, you do have to think a little bit more because certain trains literally don't go to certain boroughs. The thing about subways is that they are cheap, but I definitely can't say that they're always reliable because the amount of delays on New York City subways is absolutely insane. Like insane. Like whatever you're thinking of, if you haven't rode the subway yet, is going to be like 10 times worse when you get here. It's cheap. It's definitely cheap. That's always going to be consistent, but it's not always reliable. So that's the one thing that you have to think about with New York City. Now, taxis are a classic here in New York City. What New York City movie like filmed before 2000 didn't include a taxi? I think like every single one of them did, right? They still exist here in New York City. Uber and Lyft did not take them out of business. They are just inconvenient to get. I do have to say, I do take taxis. I still take taxis to this day. There's just something about like going outside of either my building or a restaurant and being like, oh, I have to hail a taxi versus being like, let me press a couple buttons on my phone and the car is right here. So I do have to say, taxis are almost always a better price than Uber and Lyft. Almost always. There are some times where that's definitely not the case. People typically take a taxi if they want to save a few extra bucks than they would on Uber or Lyft. Now, Uber versus Lyft. Uber has gotten so out of control in New York City. I live all the way downtown, like all the way downtown, like near Wall Street downtown. If I'm going uptown, like past Central Park uptown, that is going to cost me so much money. Definitely will cost me over $50. If not well over $50, but $50 on the low end. Whenever you're watching this video, hopefully it's not too in the future where that seems like a good price. But right now, that's not a good price at all. I love going to all different places in New York City. I love exploring different neighborhoods, going to different places. But sometimes I'm like, is it worth going all the way uptown for that price? Like, I actually think about that. How sad is that? Uber has just gotten very expensive. Now, however, Lyft, not as popular in New York City, but still popular enough you can like easily find a car in like a minute or two. And it's much cheaper than Uber. So I highly suggest taking Lyft over Uber, unless you have some type of deal with like your company or something for Uber. But I do suggest taking Lyft. Now, if you have a City Bike membership in the city, you also get a specific discount on Lyft, like a Lyft membership as well. That saves a certain percentage off each ride that you book through Lyft. So if you are a City Bike person, definitely you want to use Lyft every single time. Now, there is one other company I'm going to talk about here, and it's called Revel. I didn't put it in the title of this video because it's still very new in New York City. If you see those blue Teslas riding around, that's the Revel company. When Revel came out, it was new because it was different than Lyft and Uber because it was like specific company cars, the Revel blue Tesla cars that they were riding around the city. So it was kind of like new and exciting, and everyone wanted to be like in a Tesla instead of like some random Uber or Lyft. But at the same time, there's been a lot of issues with people trying to get the Revel cars. So it was really cool and I really liked using it when it first came out. However, it got to the point where like I could just never get a car on the app. So I just kind of like stopped using it altogether. So that was frustrating. Lyft is definitely my go-to by far. I live in a neighborhood where I don't really have a direct subway in my neighborhood at all, really. I live in Battery Park City and there's literally not a single subway here. We just have to go to the two surrounding neighborhoods to get on the subway. That also might be something that you could run into depending on where you live in Manhattan. You also might not have a subway where you're living. And if you're living outside of Manhattan, then you also might not have a subway there either. If you are going to Jersey City or Hoboken, you're gonna have to take the PATH train. So I'm gonna talk about that solely in like a separate video, kind of like explaining the full PATH train system and how that works. They look pretty similar to the subways, except actually they're a little nicer than most of the subways. Same idea, but that's gonna be a separate train called the PATH train and not the subway. So I know that was like a short video kind of just explaining the differences between all of them, and I definitely go into more detail specifically with the subways in that separate video that I was talking about, but that's going to be the gist of like comparing all of these different transportation options to each other. Now, you also have the New York City buses too, which I actually used to use a lot. I lived at one point in Midtown West, like all the way Midtown West, like next to the waterfront. I had no subways over there. Like there was just none. I was living off of 12th Avenue and I had to walk to 8th Avenue to get on the subway, which I did sometimes, but that was really annoying. So I actually did use the buses a lot when I lived over there. And it's definitely a very convenient option once you understand the bus systems. But the bus systems in New York City can be extremely hard to understand. Typically people know how to like get on their bus to go to work and go home, but they have no idea how to get around on the other buses. Probably the case for me, honestly, because I don't think I knew how to get around most other buses. I kind of just winged it or just went to like the only places I knew how to get to. So that's always another option, but those are going to be the main things. And then you also have ferries that go in and out of Manhattan to the other boroughs in some areas of New York City. I will talk about that in a separate video as well, but it's definitely a little bit more expensive because it's a boat. So you have to pay for that. But that's also kind of like a cool, fun option too, because you're like, wait, how am I like, depending on where you live, how am I commuting to work on a boat? That's kind of cool. Those are going to be the basic transportation options. My go-to is typically Lyft. I'm a Lyft person. I have like the Lyft discount with like City Bike or whatever. For my neighborhood, for my lifestyle, that's typically my go-to option. But there are definitely going to be pros and cons to everything, except Uber, because honestly, Uber is just like really overpriced right now.